They were, until probably 15 years ago, most of the lanes were seen as service space. They were giving access to properties. There were one or two, and you would have probably seen them on your strolls, there's one or two very old lanes and arcades that have always been on a sort of ant track to travel, particularly from the north through to the south of the city. Very few in an east-west direction, but several on a north-south ant track. That means that you can get from north to south really without virtually, other than crossing, you don't actually have to run along the main streets. And those have been very successful as retail opportunities, but very, very few of them. What we identified when we looked at the space in the city, that there was an awful lot of space taken up by these service lanes that if we could gradually improve the quality of those lanes, that more and more people would want to be trading not only onto the street but onto the laneway at the rear of their property. Yeah. And in some cases, some properties, they might be on a corner site where they're traditionally trading in one direction. They can turn 90 degrees and trade on the corner as well. Right. So what we did to I guess change that culture of how the lanes are used is a whole range of things. Some of it was very practical stuff like improving the paving surface, improving the lighting, improving the signage and wayfinding.
And was that in phases kind of?
And that was absolutely in phases. So we took obvious ones that we thought would be successful and tried those out. Talked to property owners about why we were doing the improvements. Sometimes, there might be just one property owner who'd already taken the plunge of opening up a shop front onto a lane already, but none of his neighbours did. So we'd then talk to those neighbours and explain to them why it might be in their interest to.
And why was the city interested in doing that?
The city was interested in doing it because we perceived it as a valuable piece of underutilised infrastructure, basically. We had a growing and thriving city. We had a growing influx of residential back into the city. So the story of the recent history of Melbourne has really been a case of turning the city around from what was a reasonably busy 8 or 9 hour day city, but it was dead at night. It was, other than a few crowds pouring out of a sporting game or into and out of a sporting game on the weekend, it was fairly quiet at weekends. We wanted to extend the hours of the city to turn it into an 18-hour city day and night, not quite a 24-hour city. So all cities have got to sleep at some point. You've got to have those downtimes, but we wanted to extend the hours of the use of the city and particularly also think about its use at weekends. And so we had a few strategies for that, but probably the most significant one was to encourage people to come and live back in the city. So Australian cities have always been quite traditionally suburban cities, so people work in the city and they live in the lower density suburbs. But we looked at the city we have here and realised we've got a classic city that could actually be, compared with many other sort of European cities, could easily be also a residential city where people would want to live. That in itself was quite controversial. When we started talking about that, a lot of people were very sceptical. They said, no, Melburnians, Australians aren't like that. They want to go home at the end of the day and live in the suburban life with a backyard. And we said, well, yeah, a lot of them will. Maybe 95% of them will. But there's another 5% who would love to live in a more urban life. And in fact, that 5% has already grown to much more than that. And the program to encourage residential back in the city has grown quite exponentially. And it's one of those things that one initiative feeds off another, and you make the city a more successful place or a more amenable place to reside, and more people come, and then more people come, and then it becomes more buzzy, and then even more people want to come. So the laneway projects was linked with that broader strategy to make the terms we use is from a monofunctional city to a multifunctional city. a multi-use city. And the laneway programs was an intrinsic, excuse me, an intrinsic part of that. The other thing that we were really trying to do was get people using public space a lot more. Excuse me, the streets in Melbourne had, and probably until 20 years ago, traditionally been seen as places for movement. You know, it's places for cars, public transport, for cycling, for walking, but they weren't seen as spaces to actually hang out and just be. And we said, look, we can actually get a lot more value out of our streets, and rather than just being seen as movement places.
Has there been actual modification of building elevations where they'll open onto the alley?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, what we tend to do through the development control process, if someone's doing alterations on a building, for instance, that backs onto a lane, we'll actually encourage them through the planning process. When they submit plans, we'll say, look, why don't, even if you're not planning to trade onto this lane, why don't you at least put an opening in there, put a window, or put something that gives some visual continuity between the public space and the lane. And then very often what happens is, you know, they do that, and that's, you know, one tick in the box, and then they suddenly realize, oh, yeah, and there's people walking up and down here. We could, you know, so it sort of opens their eyes to something they wouldn't have necessarily seen.
That's
so
awesome.
It doesn't. Again, it doesn't work all the time, and we're also conscious that some of our lanes will always only ever be service lanes.
Right.
Particularly the ones that are dead-end lanes. So you know, obviously you've got much more chance of a lane working if it's a through lane. But we've been really surprised that you could nearly say that Melbourne's sort of developed a laneway culture. It's actually it's in all our tourist brochures.
Yeah.
If you're coming to Melbourne, you wouldn't be here for very long without somebody talking to you about laneways. And so once it gets into people's psyche, we've now there are many examples of places where, for instance, there's a very successful bar and nightclub in one of the lanes here, where it's not only down a dead-end lane, it's down a dead-end lane where you go down and then you have to turn a corner that way and then you have to turn a corner that way. One of the things that has happened with the city during this period of change is that traditionally the main streets, the big 30-metre wide streets, were where all the main commerce took place.
Right.
And those were always the primary rental values, and then the little streets were secondary to that, and the laneways were the transport cousin.
Yeah.
That's all started to change. So I think if you looked at just purely sort of dollars per square metre type rates, you'll find that over the last 20 years, the little streets and the lanes have become more and more valuable. People have actually started to recognise that there's a lot more value in there than they used to think. So, and that's all good news for the city. So, I mean, one of the things we consistently manage to argue with our politicians is that spending money improving the public realm actually comes back to the city in terms of increased rateable value on the properties and increased revenue back to the city through those rateable values. So, it does actually, it's a good news story in terms of, improving the laneway projects. We have an annual budget that we put to we call our laneway commissions, and those laneway commissions can be seen as quite a broad range of initiatives. It's not all about just plonking down some art into a laneway. Sometimes it's quite ephemeral installation. It might be a lighting installation or a sound installation. Or it might be a piece of performance actually taking place in a laneway. And over a period of years, we found those as really good means of kicking off a bit of an initiative in a lane. So we might go in on year one and do some hard infrastructure improvements in terms of paving, lighting, signage, etc. Year two, we'll run a laneway arts program in that particular lane. Maybe it'll only be there for 3 months or something. It gets onto the sort of the laneways map. People go and see it. They experience that lane, and then it's in their consciousness, if you like. And they'll say, "Oh yeah, and while we were there checking out that art installation, we saw a great little cafe," and then they tell a friend. It's a way of actually getting information out there and getting people engaged with lanes that they might not have come across before. So awesome. You can see it's a whole range of initiatives.
Well, it's the original, so to speak, because the commissioning framework. Since 2001, the City of Melbourne has a public art program. This is the first time it articulated its public art strategy. And from the beginning, the public art strategy was part of an urban rejuvenation strategy. So in the urban rejuvenation strategy looked at the city centre actually being a space that was empty. People had moved out of the city. It was actually 20 years ago, the city centre was the opposite of what it is now. A very small number of residents, nobody wanted to live here. So, and it was then really a number of strategies that the city initiated, which, and that is really important to keep in mind. It's really one single strategy that does the trick in a holistic way, or in a way that can be sustained for a longer period of time. So it was things like changing the liquor licensing rules. It was something like introducing more light into the laneway, so making the laneways more safe. It was something like, in general, making the city centre a more pedestrian-friendly place, so making, widening the footpath and all of this. And the laneway commissions play a particularly strong role in it, because they are actually a cultural response to Melbourne's very distinct laneway topography. And the topography, like the CBD grid, which goes back to the surveyor model, is something that really gives the city centre a very particular character. Not only does it give the city the character in the sense of having this network of smaller lanes connecting larger ones, but it also introduces a human-like scale in the city centre, and that is actually really important. It's also, so it actually holds the opportunity for other kind of experiences. Now the